This year's Maryland Life Sciences Bioinnovation Conference is sponsored by Avantor. From breakthrough discovery to agile delivery of mission-critical products and services, Avantor is a trusted global partner to customers in the life sciences and advanced technologies and applied materials industries. Our leading global customer channel, VWR, offers an integrated, seamless purchasing experience. For more than 23 years, we have collaborated with BioBusiness Solutions to play a critical role in helping members develop scientific breakthroughs. We set science in motion to create a better world. The Maryland Department of Commerce. Welcome to Maryland, where day by day, dreamers are becoming doers, makers, and pioneers of the future. And while the state's code breakers, vaccine makers, and next-gen manufacturers are pioneering our future, they're doing it in a place that's best for their future. Make a move to Maryland to take advantage of our natural business assets, boundless resources, and amazing quality of life. The Montgomery County Office of Economic Development. Commercialize your science near the world's top scientists at NIH and FDA. Connect with us at thinkmoco.com to find your success in Montgomery County, Maryland, the immunology capital next to the nation's capital, and the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. Pharma represents the country's leading innovative biopharmaceutical research companies, which are devoted to discovering and developing medicines that enable patients to live longer, healthier, and more productive lives. Since 2000, pharma member companies have invested more than $1 trillion in the search for new treatments and cures, including $91.1 billion in 2020 alone. We'd like to thank these and all of our sponsors for their support of this year's Maryland Life Sciences Bioinnovation Conference.
This is the next Silicon Valley, and Montgomery County is absolutely the epicenter of this activity.
The county has gotten more and more adept in terms of building and permitting urban facilities for life science.
The government here encourage the growth of biotech and make it really easy to create a company here or to move a company here or to grow an existing company or a subsidiary of it in this area.
It's really an untapped resource in terms of the federal intellectual property being generated out of Montgomery County, and they're really making a push to find companies that will commercialize this priceless intellectual property.
One of the reasons why we chose Rockville is because of its close proximity to the NIH, FDA, and government agencies that we would be marketing our product to.
So we're committed to staying in Montgomery County because of all the benefits of being in this area.
Ladies and gentlemen, here to introduce your keynote speaker, please welcome the Senior Vice President of Global Corporate Affairs and Investor Relations at Novavax, Silvia Taylor.
Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to be here. I'm Silvia Taylor. I'm representing Novavax, who is one of the sponsors of today's events. And it's my very great honor and pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Melanie Saville, who is the Director of Vaccines Research and Development for SEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. So a couple words about Novavax. We're one of only a handful of companies that have been able to develop and advance a vaccine for COVID-19, something we've been working. Oh, thank you. That's so nice. So it's something that we have been working on since the beginning of the pandemic. And our early work, and that support continues today, was from SEPI, who has been an early backer and supporter of everything that we have done since their funding of us. For our vaccine, we have been able to generate a significant amount of efficacy and safety data that show that our vaccine could be a viable and important option to help end the pandemic. And Novavax and SEPI continue to collaborate as we finalize our vaccines development and move it toward authorizations around the world. And I'm very happy to say that we have been able to already complete submissions for authorization in Indonesia, India, the Philippines, and WHO, with many, many more to come soon. So about our speaker. Dr. Saville has been at SEPI for about 4 years. She has been a leader in the vaccine space, however, for many more years than that. She's a physician who has specialized in virology, and she has 20 years of experience in the development and licensure of vaccines for both the developed and the developing world. Over the years, she has been a tremendous contributor to the development and licensure of several vaccines in therapeutic areas such as seasonal and pandemic influenza, pediatric combinations, rabies, and many more. We are fortunate that Dr. Saville has harnessed all of this knowledge and experience in her role at SEPI, where she leads the team overseeing SEPI-funded vaccines in development, including ours. Her team was responsible for bringing in the vaccines into the SEPI portfolio, the vaccine candidates for COVID-19, as well as managing and supporting partners such as Novavax along the way. Her team also supports other projects related to COVID-19, including immunology projects, preclinical projects, and epidemiology projects. It's an honor to be here with you today, Dr. Saville. Thank you so much for your work and your partnership. And with that, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Silvia. And just to say, it has really been a pleasure to be working with Novavax, and really pleased to see that the submissions are beginning to start now, building on the great data that you have. If you could call up the slides, please. Great. Thank you. So I'm hoping everyone can see the slides. So really what I will be focusing on today is using the COVID-19 experience and lessons learned that we have had through the COVID-19 pandemic to look at how we can actually further accelerate with innovation preparedness for pandemics in the future. So on the next slide, what I will do is really start off with just to give you an introduction to SEPI and the work of SEPI, building on what Silvia has already said in terms of our work in epidemics and pandemics. So if you move to the next slide. Just so that you're aware, so SEPI was formed back in 2017, following the Ebola outbreak of 2014 to 2016 in West Africa, where despite years of research, there was no vaccine readily available to fight the pandemic, and market forces had really failed to drive development. And it was clearly thought that there was needed to be an organization who could respond and prepare for emerging infectious diseases, hence the formation of SEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And the key point to make here is that SEPI is about partnerships, partnering with industry, academia, governments, philanthropic organizations, and working very closely, obviously, with the regulators as another key stakeholder. And the way that we pool the resources and obviously fund the vaccine development projects and the enabling science projects. And you'll see on the next slide, the SEPI portfolio. So as it was formed in 2017, there were two key objectives to look at. The first was to develop vaccines for a list of priority pathogens. These are pathogens on the WHO R&D blueprint list, which were really pathogens who needed vaccines. There was a clear unmet medical need, but the market forces had failed to drive development. And you can see here the 5 on the right and left-hand side of the slide: MERS, Lassa, Nipah, chikungunya, and Rift Valley fever, all diseases that need vaccines. And you can see here we have a number of partnerships for each of these pathogens to develop vaccines. The second key area of SEPI before the pandemic hit was disease X. So really understanding that new diseases emerge all of the time, and we need to look at being better prepared. And one of the best ways of doing that is looking at rapid response platforms, so the mRNAs and other innovations, which can clearly accelerate development. So a number of partnerships there. So obviously, when COVID-19 hit, as an organization that is prepared to put up front at-risk funding for newly emerging infectious diseases, we also invested in COVID-19. Next slide, please. So what was SEPI's response specifically to COVID-19 pandemic? And you'll see in the next slide some important elements in terms of how COVID-19 vaccines could move forward so quickly. And there are two key elements that SEPI and others were working on that really helped to kickstart the vaccine development for COVID-19. The first is in relation to MERS vaccine development. SEPI, but others, for example, the VRC at NIAID, have put a lot of effort into good antigen design and looking at antigens in the pre-fusogenic state as strong immunogens for vaccines. And for NIAID, as well as for SEPI, MERS, another coronavirus, was an example of a virus for which vaccines were being developed. And at SEPI, we had 4 candidates for MERS vaccines in development. One of those, obviously, the Oxford group under Sarah Gilbert. So a lot of knowledge was already gained from coronaviruses that helped to kickstart the development of potent immunogens in the COVID-19 situation. The second important piece there is the work on Disease X and rapid response platforms. So one of the things that SEPI was doing specifically is if there was a newly emerging outbreak for our partners, we would do a live fire exercise in terms of developing a vaccine for that newly emerging pathogen before we knew whether or not it would have significant impact. So the combination of those two allowed SEPI to inject funding and have partnerships specifically for COVID-19 within 15 days of the sequence being identified. Next slide, please. So what was the approach to vaccine development? It was really built around 3 key areas. Speed of development. As I pointed out, the need to work on vaccines for rapid response platforms, so the mRNAs of this world, and some viral vectors we have seen have also been developed extremely rapidly. So making some initial investments in that context. And we have to remember at the time, mRNA was really still in development and was not a validated platform for infectious diseases vaccines, and was not at the scale of development that we would like to see in a pandemic situation. So the second key element relating to investment is the scale of manufacturing, ensuring that even if they may not be the most rapid to develop, that there were candidates in the portfolio that were easily scalable to hundreds of millions or billions of doses of vaccine per year in a pandemic situation. And then the third key element is access for SEPI, and equitable access is a key element to SEPI and SEPI funding to ensure that doses are available to the populations at most need, irrespective of where they are around the world. Another key element to access was ensuring a good geographical footprint of manufacturing to serve the needs of each of the regions of the globe. So you can see here that there are 12 candidate vaccines in the SEPI portfolio currently active. They have included some of the very early emergency use and licensed vaccines, some funding of Moderna, funding of AstraZeneca. We're very pleased to see indeed that the Novavax vaccine has strong data in terms of efficacy to the prototype strain, but also to variants, and more recently, just recently, Clover Biotech also showing strong efficacy against variants. So really a diversified portfolio, largely all based on the spike protein, but they're first wave candidates that will be contributing hundreds of millions to billions of doses in the 2021-2022 timeframe, but also some more early phase projects, which potentially offer some differentiation beyond the first wave of candidates. Next slide, please. So I pointed out to you really the first two elements on this slide, the importance of the MERS work that was done that allowed developers to hit the ground running when COVID-19 hit, using the work that is done on Disease X and rapid response platforms, having a broad portfolio in the context of really not knowing what was going to work. But there are a number of other key elements that need to be taken into account other than the vaccine development projects, and they're around the enabling sciences. And harmonization of assessment of COVID-19 vaccine data is critical. One of the things that has been done with WHO, NIBSC, and SEPI is the development of an international reference standard for immunological assays. And I do encourage everybody to use these reference standards so that everyone can present their data in international units. And so we can see how vaccines are performing. In addition to that, we do offer immunological assays from a laboratory network to all developers who would like to have their vaccines assessed free of charge. Another key element, obviously, is tracking SARS-CoV-2 variants. And in this context is really understanding the impact of variants may have on the effectiveness of vaccines. So we have a number of initiatives from looking in small animal models through to immunological assays to look at the impact of variants on the immune response or protection of the vaccines. And with this in mind, we're now moving to thinking about looking at more broadly protective approaches, both broadly protective SARS-CoV-2 vaccines that will be more variant proof, but broadly protective coronavirus vaccines that could protect across different types of coronaviruses. So as well as looking at individual projects again, and what data they may have for their first emergency use and license, it's important to continue to gather clinical research evidence to support policy decisions. And a number of clinical trials have been funded in order to gain additional evidence. All of these areas are also brought together under the umbrella of COVAX that I'll explain on the next slide, which brings together the equitable access. So SEPI, together with Gavi and WHO, are co-leading COVAX, working closely with UNICEF to ensure global fair allocation of vaccines and access to vaccines across the world. As of today, we've delivered over 300 million doses to over 140 countries, with an estimation of 1.4 billion of doses being delivered through this system by the end of the year and 2 billion by first quarter. Obviously, some high-income countries have very high vaccination usage at this point, and the low and middle income countries are still behind. So we really do urge everyone to, through this fair mechanism, to provide doses to COVAX. Next slide, please. And this is then just showing really what has happened, which is really extraordinary through the COVID-19 pandemic. This shows you over time the year of a pathogen being linked to the disease and how long it has taken for the US vaccine to be licensed for that specific pathogen. And you can see that classically it takes decades to get from a pathogen to licensure of a vaccine. However, what we've seen for COVID-19 is moving from the sequence to an emergency use authorization in less than a year. So really quite extraordinary from a new platform, and obviously validating that platform and showing the importance of technology and innovation to advance as rapidly as we have been able to. We move to the next slide. And then maybe just a few words on how can we be better prepared for the future, looking at some of the technical aspects on the next slide. If we move to the next slide. Thank you. What can we do in terms of vaccine development? So we've seen, I've mentioned before, there's really been transformational speed of development of the mRNA vaccines and some others. They have had to scale up as they've gone along, but we know that really the manufacturing footprint of mRNA vaccines is very small in a few countries, which has led to some inequity in terms of delivery of vaccines. We also know that work needs to be done in terms of cold chain management to make sure that those vaccines can be made available to all of the countries. Continuing to work on things like cost of goods is also very critical there. There are many vaccines in the pipeline, and with innovation come a lot of biotech companies, and they have advanced rapidly, but moving from early development through to full licensure, companies need a lot of support to do this, and it's really only in the MNCs that they have the all of the staff and the ability to do this without the needed support. Another key area to consider in the future is always ensuring that we are not taking risk in terms of safety assessment and assessment of the effectiveness of vaccines, but we must take risks to move faster. And where the majority of that risk lies in the scaling up and scaling out of manufacturing, and doing that not in a sequential way, waiting to see whether the vaccine is safe and efficacious, then taking a few more years to scale up and scale out your manufacturing process, to be prepared to put funds up front for that scale up, scale out work before you even know whether a vaccine is effective. And this is something that has been done in COVID-19, and it's something that needs to be considered always moving forward, that if you wait until you know what you have, it will be too late. In addition, animal models are critical, and having good networks of animal models is critical. And we have seen in some circumstances, there has been a lack of the models available that can slow things down. Next slide, please. So on this next slide, this just shows you some of the areas relating to regulation. I think we can all recognize that the regulators have really been very pragmatic and worked extremely rapidly to review material and look at getting vaccines through emergency use in a very timely manner. However, it would be, we need to look at other mechanisms potentially for improving that regulatory agility that we have seen in COVID-19. And one of the ways to do that is, as a platform is known, and now I think we're building the data, for example, on mRNA, that building data on platforms can really accelerate a regulatory review of a platform if you can use the platform data that is available. As people move forward very rapidly, it was actually quite difficult to compare vaccines because clinical trial endpoints were different, inclusion-exclusion criteria were different, and it would be valuable to have pre-populated regulatory assessed protocols in the future to help with this. And generally, some regulatory pragmatism needs to be continued to be built on simplified labeling, batch release testing, and post-approval changes, just as some examples where there's a considerable amount of work that needs to be done. And of course, mechanisms that will allow early discussions with regulators and WHO can help the developers move forward very rapidly. On the next slide, you'll see some of the challenges that have been faced more from a manufacturing perspective as the vaccines have been developed. And these are some examples that we have seen through COVID-19. In reality, the capacity for manufacturing of vaccines has increased significantly. But what has come with that is the fact that we have seen now raw material supply have not met the demand for vaccines. And simple things like single-use filters, bags, have actually impacted the potential to manufacture vaccines at the level that we would like to see. The multiple tech transfers have caused a lot of complexity, often transferring the technology before the process is under control. Does mean that it is difficult to ensure that we have a single product across the various manufacturing plants that are involved. We need robust QC and assays and validation, appropriate stability programs. We've seen that QA resources have been a challenge. And we've also obviously seen a number of challenges with import-export restrictions of both raw material and vaccine components. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see some of those challenges. We had a summit back in March this year as we were hearing about some of these challenges and looking at how we could address some of these challenges. And the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force was formed with the partners that you can see here from industry, from COVAX, and really looking at addressing a number of questions. Specifically looking in the short term at ensuring optimizing the manufacturing of doses of vaccine to get those doses to the countries who most need them. So we have set up a COVAX marketplace, which brings together the input suppliers with the vaccine manufacturers to find solutions to where there are specific shortages. In addition to that, we're looking at import-export with WTO and the World Trade Organization to look at ensuring that things can move as rapidly as possible in and out of countries. And also looking at ensuring with WHO leadership that there is a better geographical footprint of manufacturers in regions such as Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So with that in mind, there are a lot of lessons to be learned from COVID-19. And this has led us and others to think about the what if. We should be looking, rather than at a 320-day mission, a 100-day mission for future pandemics in the future. And this slide here shows you the 100-day mission for the G7, which is something that indeed SEPI, we're delighted that the G7 have taken on this mission together with others to look at how we can respond better to future pandemics. So if you look at the next slide, which really explains a little bit more why the 100 days. And you can see here at the top of the slide, this is data from the WHO, the extraordinary work that was done by Pfizer BioNTech to get from sequence to the first authorization from the MHRA in something like 320 days. But you can see the impact of the pandemic in that time frame, even with the non-pharmaceutical interventions that were put in place, the devastating effects of the pandemic. We're seeing now with the introductions of vaccines, the importance of the vaccines. But what if you could move from sequence to a vaccine being available for use in 100 days? You can see that we would then be in a very different place in the pandemic specifically. So if you move to the next slide. And this shows you a little bit, the complexity of a pandemic situation. I think the first thing to say is COVID-19 is not the worst case scenario. This comes from a US plan put together in 2006, which looks at various different categories of a pandemic and really based on a severity index. COVID-19 is actually quite low down on this severity index. I think the other thing to point out is you don't necessarily know where you are in the severity index. I don't think we can say categorically today what is the figure in terms of mortality for COVID-19. This is something that is an iterative process. And the reason really for saying that is you don't want to wait until you know that you have a problem before you start to act. And this is the reason for looking specifically at once you see a newly emerging pathogen, that you act straight away before you fully understand what the situation is. Next slide. So with that in mind, how should we address the disease X situation? And here just illustrates some of the areas that we've identified as critical. This is by no means exclusive, but some critical areas to work on to be better prepared for the disease X situation in the future. So probably one of the most important pieces here is to make sure that you have real-time monitoring and surveillance, which allows you to pick up emerging infectious diseases, whether these are zoonotic infections that spill over into humans, or whether they're human diseases that have mutated to a more severe form. And an understanding there of the benefit risk assessment, so having tools to really understand the surveillance and get some early warning into the types of threats that may be emerging. The second area specifically to look at working on is defining what are the top threats for a disease X situation. For example, viruses that are transmitted through the respiratory tract are at the top of the list for a future pandemic, as with the coronaviruses, as with influenza. And one of the projects that SEPI is looking at supporting moving forward is developing virus family vaccine libraries. So looking at the families that are the potential threat families for emerging infectious diseases in the future, and developing vaccine libraries, so DNA plasmid libraries of up to 15 or 20 viruses in the family, and developing vaccines, for example, on mRNA for those, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a future slide. So also looking at all of the technology pieces that can come together to get towards the 100 days. Where is the space in the system that can help us move forward much more rapidly? And then finally, taking the prototype vaccine approach. So building, for example, rapid response platforms on prototypes, and ironing out some of the challenges that remain on those rapid response platforms so that you're gathering data and improving the vaccines in peacetime while waiting for the next pandemic virus to hit. Next slide, please. And this next slide shows you a little bit more about the concept of the vaccine, the virus family vaccine libraries. Seeing here that you are looking at what are the threats on the left-hand side, what are the types of virus families, the strong emphasis on antigen design, as we had seen with MERS, having a huge advantage for the family of coronaviruses, and computational design of the immunogen is critical there. ensuring access to the vaccine platforms, such as mRNA, is critical. And looking at regulatory approaches to building the data with those virus families, looking at master files and approvals of platforms. So with that in mind, when you get to a disease X situation, you will be in probably one of three scenarios. You have a match or a close match against the virus, the vaccine you've been working on and can hit the ground running. You might have a close match of a monovalent or multivalent vaccine, and you can use that in the short term to have an impact in the pandemic. Or if it's not a good match, you can build on all of the information that you have gathered, all of the data you've gathered on antigen design to rapidly move to the development of a new vaccine. Next slide, please. And on this next slide, this is just showing you a paradigm shift, if you like, in clinical development activities, which actually means if we're talking about 100 days, we're not talking about 100 days to develop a vaccine. We're talking about all of the preparation work that needs to be done beforehand. So here, working on prototype vaccines, virus and vaccine libraries. So doing the clinical work on related viruses up front. So building on knowledge of virus families, building on knowledge of vaccine platforms. There would be very little that you could do in the 100-day period. So you would have to look very carefully at what you could do. And here the critical piece is it depends what scenario you're in. Are you in a scenario which is at the top of that list of threats, or are you in a scenario that is not at the top? Your benefit risk assessment or your anticipated benefit risk assessment would be quite different for those situations. So there may be situations where the 100-day goal is not appropriate, but others where it is critical to look at ways to a 100-day goal. This is also not to say that work would stop after 100 days. This just means looking at generating data in a different way and continuing to generate data as a vaccine is rolled out. But as I said, again, the critical piece here is it really is scenario driven based on the anticipated benefit risk. When you start, you will not know whether you need to finish, and you need to constantly adapt as you move forward. Next slide, please. So this next slide just illustrates some of the areas specifically to work on in terms of regulatory initiatives to accelerate development. So we have seen through Ebola, through COVID-19 outbreaks, that this has led to significant regulatory innovation. And SEPI will continue to partner with regulators at a global level to look at the lessons learned from the COVID-19 situation and others, to look at supporting regulatory innovation in the future. And there are a number of key areas where regulatory innovation can occur, from streamlining and accelerating vaccine development, adapting guidelines, harmonizing outbreak readiness pathways, and regulatory approaches from an anticipated benefit risk assessment. And obviously, I think, as I said, we can anticipate there'll be a lot of lessons learned moving forward, and a lot of potential areas of innovation to move forward. So if you move to the next slide, and this just shows you in a summary some of the areas that SEPI specifically are looking to work on in the next 5 years towards the 100-day goal and towards being better prepared for pandemics moving forward. And we are obviously looking to partner with industry, with academia on all of these key areas to advance vaccine development. So as we look at things in three strategic objectives in the context of prepare, transform, and connect. So in the context of prepare, we need to strengthen our defenses against COVID-19 and reduce the risk of future COVID-19 coronavirus pandemics. So we need to continue R&D for COVID-19, making vaccines more variant-proof, but also looking at more broadly protective coronavirus vaccine approaches. And we also need to continue to build on developing vaccines for known threats, as there are still a number of emerging infectious diseases for which there is no vaccine available. And all of this data helps to build the platforms and knowledge on the platforms for future pandemics. In the context of transform, I've mentioned the production of libraries of vaccines and other biologics, but also working systematically at compressing vaccine development timelines to 100 days. And this really requires looking at potentially new ways of approaches to vaccine development to get to that 100 days. In the context of Connect, SEPI plans to have some very targeted projects, but we also understand and welcome that there are many other initiatives, and SEPI wishes to connect with these other initiatives to ensure that the global networks are formed of laboratory capacity, preclinical models, and other activities in similar areas, that we are all using our resources appropriately. As an organization that is committed to equitable access, we also look at supporting efforts specifically in low and middle income countries where the infrastructure needs to be built, and often where many of these outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics will emerge. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that's whetted your appetite for potential collaboration with SEPI in the future. Thank you.
At this point, if anyone has any questions, please approach the microphone for questions.
So I greatly enjoyed your presentation. I'm Michael Saugaller with the NIH. And I was wondering if the organization is doing anything to create education and awareness about the importance of vaccines, given that vaccine hesitancy is a problem at different parts around the globe, and developing technologies are only good if people take them. So is any part of your mission including addressing vaccine hesitancy?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think, as you point out, in different parts of the world, the reasons for vaccine hesitancy can be quite different, and it's a really important topic. Specifically for SEPI, our main focus there in terms of vaccine hesitancy is more around community engagement for clinical trials. But as part of COVAX, as we are partnering with Gavi and WHO. Gavi and WHO have specific initiatives to really look at vaccine hesitancy within the countries where the vaccines will be delivered. So a really important question to be addressed, and quite a diverse set of issues that can be quite culturally and country specific. So certainly under COVAX, that's an important part of ensuring that as these vaccines are being offered, that those questions are being addressed.
I'm Brad Fackler with the Maryland Tech Council, and I'm monitoring the online participants. We have a question that came in. How are partnerships with SEPI initiated?
Great. So good question. So the way that SEPI works is through open calls for proposals on topics. So where we have a strategic initiative, we will launch a call for proposal and invite applications. They will be reviewed both by internal, external to SEPI reviewers, and recommendations will be made to move projects forward. As the projects actually move forward, then we move forward as a partnership. So the development partner is the IND holder for the project, and SEPI actually offers some technical support to the partner where it is needed. And we recognize that we have a number of different types of partners, and so the level of support needed by each individual partner can be quite different, but it's very much a supportive approach. And I would say not dissimilar to the sort of approach, for example, that BARDA takes in the investments that it makes in vaccine development.
Seeing that there are no additional questions, we will conclude our keynote session. Thank you.
Thank you.
This year's Maryland Life Sciences Bioinnovation Conference is sponsored by Emergent Biosolutions. Emergent Biosolutions is a global life sciences company whose mission is to protect and enhance life. Through Emergent specialty products and contract development and manufacturing services, Emergent is dedicated to providing solutions that address public health threats. In working together, Emergent envisions protecting or enhancing 1 billion lives by 2030. AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca is a global, science-led biopharmaceutical company that focuses on the discovery, development, and commercialization of prescription medicines in oncology and biopharmaceuticals, including cardiovascular, renal and metabolism, and respiratory and immunology. Based in Cambridge, UK, AstraZeneca operates in more than 100 countries, and its innovative medicines are used by millions of patients worldwide. And GSK, a science-led global healthcare company with a special purpose: to help people do more, feel better, live longer. We'd like to thank these and all of our sponsors for their support of this year's Maryland Life Sciences Bioinnovation Conference.